Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The summer of 1894 brought an unusual drought to the Ozark Mountains, where the normally lush forests and flowing springs seemed to wither under an unrelenting sun. Nestled deep within a secluded valley near the Buffalo River, the Ravenwood Inn stood as one of the few waypoints for travelers making their way through the rugged terrain of northwestern Arkansas. The inn had been constructed in 1872 by Bartholomew Mercer, a man who had traveled west from Virginia after the Civil War, seeking both fortune and anonymity in the remote highlands. According to county records preserved in the Boone County Historical Society archives, the Ravenwood Inn was initially quite prosperous. The establishment was strategically positioned at a crossroads where travelers from Missouri, heading south toward Little Rock, would often stop for rest. The two-story structure was impressive for its time and location. Built from locally quarried limestone with a wide front porch and 6 guest rooms on the upper floor. A separate building behind the main structure housed the kitchen and dining room, connected by a covered walkway that shielded guests from inclement weather. What made the Ravenwood Inn particularly notable was its isolation. The nearest settlement of any size was approximately 17 miles away, over difficult mountain trails. This remoteness made it an essential stopping point for weary travelers, but it also meant that what happened at the inn remained largely unwitnessed by outsiders. For nearly 20 years, Bartholomew Mercer and his wife Victoria operated the establishment without incident, developing a reputation for cleanliness and simple but satisfying meals. Their 2 employees, Sullivan Hayes and his wife Imogene, had been with them since the inn's opening. Local resident Josiah Hammond, now in his 90s, recalled to this researcher his childhood memories of the inn. "My father would sometimes take our produce there to sell to Mr. Mercer," Hammond said. "It was a grand place by our standards then, 2 stories high with real glass windows and painted shutters. Mr. Mercer always paid fair prices and was polite enough, though he wasn't one for unnecessary conversation. Mrs. Mercer was more sociable, always offering a slice of pie or a cup of coffee. They seemed like ordinary folks running a business, nothing to suggest what would happen later." By the spring of 1894, however, something changed at the Ravenwood Inn. According to postal records and stagecoach manifests, several travelers who had indicated their intention to stay at the establishment never arrived at their final destinations. At first, these disappearances attracted little attention. The Ozarks were dangerous terrain, with steep ravines, treacherous river crossings, and the occasional outlaw. Travelers going missing was not entirely uncommon in such wild country. Rebecca Miller, whose great-grandfather operated a stagecoach service through the region, shared with me several logbooks from that period. The records show at least 4 regular passengers who boarded stages heading toward Little Rock but never completed their journeys, she explained. The drivers noted that these individuals had planned to stay overnight at the Ravenwood Inn. At the time, no connection was made between these separate incidents. It wasn't until September of that year that local authorities began to notice a disturbing pattern. Zachariah Powell, a circuit-riding judge from Springfield, Missouri, had documented in his personal journal that at least 7 travelers he knew of had vanished without explanation after planning to stay at Ravenwood. His observations might have gone unnoticed had the judge himself not disappeared after setting out to investigate the matter personally. Powell's journal, now preserved in the state archives, contains a final entry dated September 16, 1894. "Tomorrow I shall ride to the Ravenwood establishment and make inquiries directly of Mercer. These disappearances cannot be mere coincidence, and as an officer of the court, I cannot in good conscience ignore the pattern that has emerged. If my suspicions prove unfounded, I shall be relieved. If not, justice must be served. County Sheriff Malcolm Hargrove assembled a small posse to visit the inn in October 1894, arriving unannounced at dusk. What they discovered has been preserved in a series of sworn affidavits stored in the state archives in Little Rock. The affidavits describe how Hargrove and his men found the inn apparently abandoned, with no sign of the Mercers, their employees, or any guests. A meal had been left half-prepared in the kitchen, bread dough still rising in a wooden bowl. Beds were made, and personal belongings of the Mercers remained in their private quarters. Deputy William Fletcher's affidavit provides a vivid description of the scene. It was as if the occupants had stepped outside for a moment and were expected to return any minute. A pipe was still warm on the office desk. A ledger lay open, the ink not fully dry on the last entry. In the kitchen, a kettle of stew simmered on the stove. Yet not a soul could be found on the premises, though we searched every room and called out repeatedly. What aroused the sheriff's suspicion, however, was the discovery of a locked cellar door that did not appear on the original building plans filed when the inn was constructed. After breaking through the heavy oak door, Hargrove and his men descended a narrow staircase into what was described as a chamber of mystery. The cellar was divided into several small rooms, each carefully furnished as if for extended stays. Inside one room, they found a collection of personal effects, watches, wallets, jewelry, and clothing that appeared to belong to at least 20 different individuals. Deputy Samuel Rutledge's affidavit describes the discovery. In what appeared to be a storage room, we found a large trunk filled with personal possessions. There were pocket watches of various makes, each engraved with different initials, wallets containing identification papers, and small amounts of money, several fine jewelry pieces that a gentleman might wear, cufflinks, tie pins, and such. Ladies' items, too, brooches, necklaces, and the like. Most disturbing was finding that each item could be matched to the name of a traveler known to have disappeared after staying at the inn. The most puzzling discovery, according to Rutledge's testimony, was a leather-bound ledger in which Bartholomew Mercer had meticulously recorded details about each guest who had stayed at the inn. The ledger contained names, occupations, destinations, and estimated wealth of each traveler. Some names were marked with strange symbols, with no apparent explanation. Sheriff Hargrove's own statement notes, "The ledger was unlike any guest book I had previously encountered. Beyond the usual information one might expect, names, dates of arrival, and presumed departure, Mercer had recorded extensive personal details about each guest. Their manner of speech, habits, family connections, financial circumstances, and whether they were likely to be missed if they failed to reach their destination. Most curious were the notations beside certain names, symbols resembling a circle with a line through it, or sometimes a small star or crescent moon. Despite an extensive search of the surrounding area, no other evidence was found. The nearby Buffalo River was dragged, caves were explored, and the ground around the property was examined for recently disturbed earth, all without result. The Mercers, their employees, and any guests who might have been at the inn had simply vanished. The search party made one additional discovery that initially seemed insignificant, but would later prove important: a small leather-bound book found wedged behind a shelf in Bartholomew Mercer's office. The book contained what appeared to be coded entries, written in a combination of symbols and numbers that made no immediate sense to the investigators. The book was catalogued as evidence and largely forgotten until many years later. Theories about what occurred at the Ravenwood Inn varied widely. Some speculated that Bartholomew Mercer, who claimed to be a former medical doctor, had led his guests to another location for reasons unknown. Others suggested that the Mercers themselves might have been victims of whatever disaster had claimed their guests. The most practical-minded investigators proposed that the inn had been a front for a sophisticated robbery operation, with the Mercers relieving travelers of their valuables, before eliminating witnesses. Local newspapers reported various theories, from the plausible to the outlandish. The Springfield Daily Herald ran a headline on October 23, 1894, asking, "Massacre at Mountain Inn?" while the more sensational Arkansas Gazette suggested, "Ozark demons claim travelers." More measured coverage in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch framed the story as "Mystery in the Mountains. Travelers and innkeepers vanish without trace." A particularly intriguing account emerged in 1896 when Abigail Thornton, a young woman from a neighboring county, came forward with a statement that added a new dimension to the mystery. Thornton claimed that she had been employed briefly as a maid at the inn in early 1894, but had fled after witnessing strange behavior by Bartholomew Mercer. According to her signed statement, preserved in the county courthouse archives, Thornton observed Mercer acting increasingly secretive and paranoid. She described how he frequently locked himself in his office for hours, murmuring to himself, and how she had found strange symbols drawn in various places around the property. Most disturbing was her claim that Mercer maintained what he called a collection in a locked room where she was forbidden to enter. Mr. Mercer would sometimes speak of his guests as if they were specimens in a collection, Thornton stated. Once, after a gentleman from St. Louis had departed, or so I was told, I heard Mr. Mercer tell his wife that another fine edition had been secured. When I inquired later about the gentleman, hoping for a generous tip that might have been left behind, Mrs. Mercer told me sharply never to mention departed guests. Thornton's account might have been dismissed as fantasy had investigators not already discovered the locked rooms in the cellar and the collection of personal effects. Her description of Mercer's secretive behavior matched the meticulous record-keeping evident in the discovered ledger. She also provided information about a series of tunnels allegedly constructed beneath the inn, tunnels that were subsequently discovered during a more thorough investigation of the property in spring of 1897. Thornton's statement continued. There was a night when I couldn't sleep due to a terrible thunderstorm. I went downstairs to make a cup of tea and saw Mr. Mercer leading a gentleman toward the cellar door. The gentleman seemed unsteady on his feet, as if perhaps he'd had too much to drink, though he had been perfectly sober at dinner. Mr. Mercer was speaking to him in a low, soothing voice, like one might speak to a nervous horse. When I made a noise accidentally, Mr. Mercer turned and saw me. The look in his eyes frightened me so badly that I returned to my room and barred the door. I gave my notice the very next day. These passages extended from the cellar in three directions, one leading to a concealed exit in a nearby ravine, another to a small cave system approximately a quarter-mile from the inn, and a third that appeared to dead-end inexplicably beneath the stables. This third tunnel became the focus of intense speculation after workers attempting to seal the passages reported hearing what they described as faint rhythmic tapping coming from beyond the apparent terminus, despite bringing in additional men and equipment to break through what was believed to be a false wall. No further passage was ever discovered. The tapping sound ceased after 3 days, never to be heard again. The mystery of what or who might have been attempting to communicate from beyond that wall remains unsolved to this day. Franklin Morris, one of the workers involved in the 1897 exploration, left a written account that was passed down through his family. We were certain there was a hollow space behind that wall. The sound was unmistakable, a deliberate tapping like a signal. 3 taps, then a pause, then 3 more. We marked the spot and began to cut through the stone, but the work was slow going with the tools we had. By the 3rd day, the tapping had stopped. When we finally broke through a week later, we found only solid earth beyond, as if the passage had been deliberately filled in. Some of the men refused to return after that, claiming the place was haunted. I don't hold with such notions myself, but I cannot explain what we heard or why we found nothing. In the years that followed, The case of the Ravenwood Inn generated considerable attention in regional newspapers and even received mention in several national publications. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a series of articles in 1898 titled "The Mystery of the Missing of the Ozarks," which sensationalized many aspects of the case but included several factual details not previously made public. Among these was the revelation that Bartholomew Mercer was not, in fact, from Virginia as he had claimed. Investigation into his background revealed that he had been born Baldwin Mortensen in Austria, where he had studied medicine before emigrating to America in 1862. Records indicated that he had briefly worked at a hospital in Philadelphia before his credentials were questioned, forcing him to abandon his practice. What he did between leaving Philadelphia in 1865 and establishing the inn in 1872 remains unknown. The Post-Dispatch articles, written by journalist Edward Thornhill, suggested that Mercer might have been involved in unsavory activities during those missing years. Sources in Philadelphia indicate that Mortensen, as he was then known, departed under a cloud of suspicion following the unexplained disappearance of two patients under his care. Though no charges were ever filed, hospital administrators were reportedly preparing to dismiss him when he vanished overnight, taking with him certain medical records and a substantial amount of surgical equipment. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire Ravenwood affair was the fact that no definitive evidence about the fate of the disappeared was ever found. Despite the discovery of personal effects belonging to missing travelers, no other trace was recovered. It was as if the victims had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only their possessions and the troubling questions about their fate. In 1899, a journalist from the Kansas City Star named Percival Hammond undertook an in-depth investigation of the case, interviewing numerous individuals connected to the inn and the investigation. His findings, published as a small monograph titled "The Vanished of Ravenwood," suggested an intriguing theory. Hammond proposed that Bartholomew Mercer might have been operating a sophisticated identity relocation operation, helping people who wished to disappear start new lives under new names. The journalist cited testimony from a former medical colleague of Mercer's from Philadelphia, who stated that the doctor had frequently mentioned his desire to help people begin anew away from their troubled lives. Though such a concept seemed far-fetched on a large scale, Hammond's investigation uncovered that Mercer had corresponded with various contacts in distant cities and possessed documents that could be used to create new identities. Letters found among Mercer's possessions included references to new beginnings and alternate lives, terms that might suggest some kind of clandestine operation. Dr. James Whitfield, who had worked alongside Mercer in Philadelphia, told Hammond, "Mortensen, or Mercer, as you call him now, was obsessed with the concept of identity. He often spoke of how a person might shed their past like a snake, shedding its skin. He believed that many people were trapped in lives they despised and would pay handsomely for the opportunity to become someone else entirely. I took it as philosophical musing at the time, but perhaps he found a way to turn this obsession into a profitable enterprise." Hammond theorized that the disappearances were not violent crimes, but a voluntary disappearance operation, that Mercer was offering the opportunity for unhappy people to abandon their existing lives and start anew elsewhere for a substantial price. This would explain the absence of evidence of violence and the fact that some of the missing persons had previously expressed unhappiness with their circumstances. "Consider the advantages of such an establishment," Hammond wrote in his monograph, "located in a remote area where few questions would be asked, positioned on a crossroads frequented by travelers from all directions. What better place to operate a business that required absolute discretion? The inn would provide a perfect setting for the transitional phase of such a process, a place where one could safely shed an old identity and prepare to assume a new one." The theory gained more credibility when Hammond discovered reports of apparently new individuals appearing in distant communities throughout the Ozarks shortly after the Ravenwood disappearances. In one particularly intriguing case from early 1894, a merchant whom nobody knew established himself in Fayetteville, possessing considerable resources and knowledge, but no verifiable history. When questioned about his past, the man gave vague answers or changed the subject. A Fayetteville newspaper article from April 1894, uncovered by Hammond, reported, "A new business has opened on Main Street, a bookshop operated by one Howard Lawson, recently arrived from back east," as he puts it. Mr. Lawson appears well educated and financially comfortable, though reticent about his specific origins. The establishment has been well received, particularly by the university community, who appreciate Mr. Lawson's extensive knowledge of literature and apparent familiarity with academic circles, though he claims no formal university affiliation himself. Hammond's investigation also shed light on another interesting pattern. Many of the travelers who disappeared had complicated personal histories. Hammond documented at least 15 cases of individuals who had recently experienced bankruptcies, scandals, or marital problems before their fateful journeys. Local authorities had paid little attention to these details, but Hammond suggested that these people might have been specifically attracted by the promise of a new beginning. One such case involved a merchant known as Jonathan Miller, who had suffered a devastating bankruptcy shortly before his journey through the Ozarks. According to local reports, Miller had expressed despair about his situation and vaguely commented about finding a way out. Curiously, several months after his disappearance, a man with similar physical characteristics, but using a different name, appeared in a Texas town operating a successful business. When confronted by a former acquaintance, the man claimed no knowledge of who Jonathan Miller was. The acquaintance, Thomas Whitaker, provided Hammond with a sworn statement. "I would stake my life on it being Miller, despite his denials." He had the same distinctive scar above his right eyebrow, though he had grown a beard and affected different mannerisms. When I pressed him, insisting I knew him from Cincinnati, he became agitated and threatened to call the sheriff if I didn't leave his establishment. Later that evening, as I was dining at the local hotel, he approached my table and whispered, "For both our sakes, forget you ever knew Jonathan Miller. That man is dead and buried." He then placed a gold coin on the table and walked away without another word. Hammond's investigation took a particularly interesting turn when he tracked down Marianne Mortensen, Bartholomew's sister, who was living in Baltimore. Marianne provided the journalist with letters she had received from her brother between 1888 and 1893, letters that revealed a man obsessed with the concept of reinvention. In one particularly revealing passage from an 1891 letter, Bartholomew wrote, "Identity is merely a social construct, dear sister. The name by which we are known, the work we do, the connections we maintain, all of this can be left behind and rebuilt. I am helping people realize that their lives are not permanent prisons, that they can escape the circumstances that entrap them simply by disappearing." Marianne told Hammond that she had viewed these reflections as philosophical, never imagining that her brother might actually be helping people disappear. She had ceased corresponding with him in late 1893 after receiving a letter that disturbed her, in which Bartholomew suggested that soon he himself might emerge in a new form. She burned the letter immediately and never wrote to him again. "I always knew Baldwin had unusual ideas," Marianne told Hammond, "even as a child. He was fascinated by the concept of transformation, how caterpillars became butterflies, how actors became their characters. Our father was a strict disciplinarian who mapped out Baldwin's entire life before he was 10 years old: medical school, a prestigious practice, a suitable marriage. I sometimes wonder if his obsession with escaping one's identity stemmed from his desire to escape the life our father had planned for him. Hammond's investigation also uncovered a connection between Bartholomew Mercer and several other individuals operating similar stations at remote locations throughout the country. Particularly notable was Dr. Thaddeus Pembroke, a contemporary of Mercer's at medical school in Vienna, who had also emigrated to America and established a remote lodge in Colorado. According to Hammond's research, Pembroke and Mercer had maintained regular correspondence, apparently coordinating the movement of clients between their locations. Pembroke's lodge, like the Ravenwood Inn, was located in an isolated area and had also been associated with several unexplained disappearances, though on a smaller scale. The lodge had closed abruptly in 1889 after a fire destroyed the main building, and Pembroke himself had vanished without a trace, possibly becoming a client of his own service. Hammond speculated that Pembroke and Mercer might have been operating a secret network of disappearance stations, offering a clandestine service to those desperate enough to abandon everything. This would explain the elaborate tunnels found beneath the Ravenwood Inn, secret exit routes to allow clients to depart unobserved. I believe what we have uncovered is not a series of murders, but an elaborate underground railroad of sorts, Hammond wrote in his conclusion. Not for escaped slaves seeking freedom, but for individuals seeking escape from lives that had become intolerable to them. Whether this operation was criminal in nature depends on one's perspective. Certainly there is fraud involved in assuming a new identity, and perhaps these individuals left behind debts and obligations that remained unfulfilled. But if no one was harmed, if participation was entirely voluntary, then perhaps what occurred at Ravenwood represents a different kind of crime altogether, one against the social contract itself, the implicit agreement that we must remain who we are born to be. Most intriguing was Hammond's discovery of a letter from Pembroke to Mercer dated 1887, in which the Colorado physician referenced what he called the Chicago situation, describing it as a complete success despite initial complications. The Chicago Tribune archives for that year include reports of 5 prominent citizens who disappeared without explanation, each taking with them substantial sums of money, only to have new identities appear in other states months later. Hammond could not find a direct connection between these cases and Mercer, but the coincidence is intriguing. The letter, partially damaged by water but still legible in places, read, "The Chicago situation resolved most satisfactorily. All 5 transitions completed without incident, though J. required additional coaching to maintain his new persona convincingly. The fee structure you suggested proved most advantageous. The graduated scale based on complexity and risk is both fair and profitable." I have now established contact with R. in San Francisco, who expresses interest in establishing a Western outpost for our enterprise. The demand appears limitless, so many people trapped in lives they despise, willing to pay handsomely for release. By 1900, interest in the Ravenwood case had largely faded from public consciousness. The property remained abandoned, developing a reputation for being cursed or haunted, though such superstitions have no place in a serious examination of the facts. In 1905, the main building was destroyed in a forest fire, eliminating whatever physical evidence might have remained. The tunnels beneath the property were sealed by state authorities in 1906, after several local youths became lost in the complex while exploring. The entrance in the ravine was dynamited shut, and the cave system was blocked with a steel grate that remains in place to this day, though its exact location has been intentionally obscured in official records to discourage curiosity seekers. Elmer Cranston, one of the workers involved in sealing the tunnels, later told his grandson, "It was the strangest job I ever worked. Those tunnels weren't natural. They'd been carefully dug and reinforced, like mining tunnels, but much more finished. There were rooms down there some with furniture still in them, beds, desks, even a few books. One room had a wall covered with maps showing routes through the mountains, with marks at certain locations. Another had what looked like a photography studio with a backdrop showing a city street and various props. The whole place gave me an uneasy feeling, like we were disturbing something that should have been left alone. The final chapter in the Ravenwood saga came in 1912, when a man named Julian Foster died in a Denver hospital. According to medical records, Foster made a deathbed confession to being Sullivan Hayes, one of the employees from the inn who had disappeared in 1894. His account, transcribed by hospital staff, described how Bartholomew Mercer had operated an elaborate identity relocation service. Hayes claimed that he and his wife had voluntarily assisted the scheme for years, until they became concerned about Mercer's growing instability. According to Hayes, Bartholomew had begun to believe his own false narratives, frequently referring to himself by different names and exhibiting distinct personalities. When Hayes and his wife expressed concern, Mercer became threatening, and they fled. Dr. Samuel Brockton, who attended Foster Hayes in his final days, recorded the confession. The patient insists that his true name is Sullivan Hayes, formerly employed at an establishment called the Ravenwood Inn in Arkansas. He claims to have participated in what he describes as a service for the desperate, an operation that facilitated the disappearance and reinvention of individuals seeking to escape their lives. According to Hayes, clients would arrive at the inn, usually by pre-arrangement, through a network of discreet contacts. After a period of preparation in the secret rooms beneath the inn, during which they would learn the details of their new identities, they would depart via the hidden tunnels, emerging miles away, to begin their new lives. Most interesting was Hayes's claim that Mercer had eventually used his own service, disappearing with his wife Victoria and assuming the identities of two of his clients. This would explain why the Mercers' personal effects remained at the inn. They had fully adopted their new lives. Mercer and his wife had planned their own disappearance for months, Hayes told Dr. Brockton. They had selected suitable candidates from among their clients, a wealthy cattle merchant from Missouri and his wife, who wished to escape creditors after a series of poor investments. The switch was made in September of 1894. My wife and I were supposed to continue operating the inn as caretakers until new management could be arranged, but we became frightened when a judge began asking questions. We fled before the sheriff's raid, taking nothing with us. I have lived in fear for 18 years, certain that Mercer, now living as someone else entirely, would eventually find me. Hayes's deathbed confession raised more questions than it answered. If his account was accurate, it suggested a far more extensive scheme than previously suspected, potentially involving dozens or even hundreds of individuals who had voluntarily chosen to disappear. Dr. Brockton made careful notes of the confession and later corresponded with authorities in Arkansas about the case. Brockton observed that Hayes Foster exhibited no signs of delirium or confabulation typical in terminal patients. His account was coherent and included numerous specific details that could be verified against the historical record. I have treated many dying patients who felt compelled to unburden their souls, Brockton wrote to Sheriff Carlton Williams, who had replaced Hargrove in Boone County. Some confessed to imaginary crimes, seeking a form of absolution before death. But Hayes's account contains too many verifiable details to be dismissed as mere fantasy. He described the layout of the inn, the contents of the ledger found in the cellar, and the structure of the tunnel system with remarkable accuracy, details that were not widely published in the press accounts I have been able to locate. I am inclined to believe that, while perhaps not the complete truth, his story contains substantial elements of fact. In 1914, partly in response to Hayes's confession, a small expedition was organized to revisit the Ravenwood site, led by Dr. Brockton and funded by a private individual with an interest in the case, the team spent 2 weeks excavating the ruins of the stable. Their findings were documented in a privately published monograph titled Return to Ravenwood, copies of which are now extremely rare. According to this account, the team discovered a small hidden chamber beneath the stable floor, accessed via a disguised trapdoor. The chamber had partially collapsed, likely during the fire, but remained largely intact. Inside, they found a metal strongbox containing what appeared to be forged documents, blank birth certificates, official seals, and a detailed guide for creating new identities. Frederick Chambers, a member of the expedition, described the discovery in a letter to his sister. It was the most extraordinary find, a veritable forgery workshop hidden beneath what appeared to be an ordinary stable. The strongbox contained not only blank documents, but detailed instructions for creating convincing life histories, suggestions for how to adopt mannerisms and speech patterns consistent with new identities, and even recipes for various dyes and compounds to alter one's appearance. It was as if someone had created a comprehensive manual for disappearing completely and becoming someone else. The strongbox also contained what appeared to be a journal belonging to Bartholomew Mercer, spanning the years 1889 to 1894. The journal described in practical detail the operation of his relocation service, how to identify potential clients, how much to charge for different levels of service, and techniques for establishing convincing new identities in distant locations. The ideal client, one entry read, is a person of means who has suffered a significant social or financial setback, bankruptcy, scandal, or personal tragedy. Such individuals are motivated not by criminal intent, but by a desperate desire to escape their circumstances. They make excellent candidates for relocation, as they typically possess the resources necessary for a successful transition and the motivation to maintain their new identities indefinitely. They are also less likely to draw persistent investigation, as their disappearance can often be attributed to suicide or flight from creditors. The final entries in the journal, dated October 1894, described Mercer's growing paranoia about imminent investigations. The last entry simply read, "Discovery imminent. Time to implement our own contingency plan. The next time I write, it will be with another hand, another name, in another life." Brockton's expedition also discovered something Hayes had not mentioned, a small adjacent chamber containing dozens of empty traveling trunks and valises, each marked with the initials or names of different individuals. Presumably these belonged to Mercer's clients, who had left their personal belongings behind when adopting new identities. One trunk bore the inscription J.M., possibly belonging to the missing merchant Jonathan Miller. Inside was a folded document that appeared to be a farewell letter never sent. The letter read in part, "My dearest Margaret, by the time you read this, if indeed you ever do, Jonathan Miller will no longer exist. The failures and disappointments that have defined his life will be buried with his name. I cannot ask you to understand or forgive this final act of desperation, only to know that it brings me a measure of peace to think that you and the children will be better provided for by my absence than by my continued presence." The expedition's findings were documented in detail, but Dr. Brockton chose not to publish them widely, concerned about the implications for those who might still be living under assumed identities. To expose this scheme in its entirety, he wrote in the conclusion of the privately circulated monograph, would potentially disrupt the lives of dozens, perhaps hundreds of individuals who have spent decades building new lives. Whatever their reasons for choosing to disappear, and I make no moral judgment on those choices, it seems unnecessarily cruel to strip away the identities they have maintained for so long. The principals in this case, the Mercers and Judge Powell, are almost certainly deceased by now. Perhaps it is best to let this mystery fade into history. In 1956, a small metal box was discovered during construction work near the former site of the inn. Inside were several blank identity documents and a fragment of a letter written in what appears to be Bartholomew Mercer's handwriting. The partial text, now housed in the state archives, contains a single legible passage: "Success at last. The transition is complete." I look out at my new life with an entirely fresh perspective. The past has been left behind. I have conquered the final frontier, not death, but the possibility of rebirth. Authorities dismissed the find as an elaborate hoax, noting inconsistencies in the paper and ink formulations compared to authentic documents of the period. Yet handwriting analysis conducted in 1968 indicated striking similarities to known samples of Mercer's writing, raising questions about the document's authenticity that remain unresolved. The discovery of the metal box led to a brief resurgence of interest in the Ravenwood case. Dr. Victor Wexler, a psychiatrist from St. Louis University, published a paper in 1957 analyzing the psychological aspects of the case. Wexler proposed that Bartholomew Mercer might have developed a fascination with the concept of fluid identity, the idea that people could completely reinvent themselves, leaving their old lives behind. The Ravenwood case presents a fascinating psychological study, Wexler wrote. Here was an individual so captivated by the concept of identity transformation that he created an entire clandestine business around it. But more than that, Mercer appears to have been conducting a lifelong experiment on the nature of selfhood. His journals suggest a man who questioned whether any of us are truly fixed in our identities, or whether we might become entirely different people given the right circumstances. Dr. Wexler theorized that in helping others disappear, Mercer might have developed his own form of identity disorder, eventually losing his sense of who he really was. Rather than a simple criminal operation, Wexler saw the case as a fascinating study in psychology, someone so obsessed with identity transformation that he eventually lost his own. This theory gained support when Wexler discovered medical records from the Philadelphia hospital, where Bartholomew had worked briefly in the 1860s. These records indicated that Mercer had shown unusual interest in patients with memory and identity disorders, often spending hours conversing with them and documenting their cases in meticulous detail. "Patient exhibits remarkable adaptability," Mercer had written about one case. "Following traumatic head injury, he has adopted an entirely new personality, believing himself to be a merchant from Boston rather than the Pennsylvania farmer he was previously. Most intriguing is the completeness of this transition. He has constructed an entire life history for his new identity, with detailed memories of places he has never visited and people he has never met. If the mind can create such a convincing alternative reality spontaneously, might it be possible to induce such a transition deliberately under controlled conditions?" In 1975, criminologist Charles Demarest proposed yet another theory about the Ravenwood disappearances. After reviewing all available evidence, Demarest suggested that the Mercers might have been operating something even more organized, an entire network dedicated to helping people disappear for money. He pointed to certain symbols found in Bartholomew Mercer's notebooks that appeared to be codes for different routes and destinations. Demarest's research uncovered references to a group called the Pathway, allegedly founded in Europe in the 1840s by a circle of idealists who believed that people should have the right to completely reinvent themselves. According to fragmentary records Demarest discovered, this group operated an international network of stations where individuals could effectively disappear and emerge as new people. The symbolic language found in Mercer's documents, Demarest wrote in his analysis, bears striking similarities to codes used by organizations like the Underground Railroad. Specific symbols appear to denote routes, safe houses, and the types of services available at different locations. This suggests not an isolated operation, but a systematic network with established protocols and multiple operatives across a wide geographic area. If Bartholomew Mercer had indeed been a member of such a group, the Ravenwood Inn might have been more than an isolated operation. It could have been part of a larger network that facilitated voluntary disappearances. This would explain the sophistication of the operation and Mercer's extensive correspondence with contacts in distant locations. Demarest's investigation took an intriguing turn when he began to identify patterns in the Ravenwood disappearances. Analyzing the guest records recovered from the cellar, he noticed that many of the disappeared had arrived at regular intervals, approximately every 6 weeks, suggesting a coordinated schedule of operations. Furthermore, almost all the missing were single individuals, without children or close relatives, precisely the type of person who could disappear with minimal search or investigation. What emerges from this analysis, Demarest concluded, is not the work of a murderer or even a simple con artist, but a sophisticated operation designed to help certain individuals vanish completely. The elaborate preparations, the carefully constructed tunnels, the forgery workshop all suggest a level of organization and planning that goes far beyond what one would expect from a simple criminal enterprise. This was, in essence, an early form of what we might today call an identity reassignment program, operating completely outside the bounds of legal oversight. In 1978, Demarest published a book titled The Vanished, The Secret History of Abandoned Identities, in which he outlined his theories about the pathway and its possible connection to the Ravenwood case. The book received limited attention at the time but developed a cult following among those interested in unsolved historical mysteries. Demarest's theory remains speculative, but offers an intriguing explanation for the events at Ravenwood, that the missing people may have chosen their fate, paying to leave their troubled identities behind and start new lives elsewhere. In 1982, an archaeological survey was conducted in the area where the Ravenwood Inn had stood. Using ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques, researchers hoped to discover any physical evidence that might have survived the 1905 fire and subsequent decades of neglect. The survey revealed several anomalies beneath the former site of the stables, areas of disturbed earth that might indicate buried remains or artifacts. Excavation permits were obtained, and a team from the State University began careful exploration of the site in the summer of 1983. What they discovered was a series of additional hidden compartments, each containing small metal boxes with personal documents, letters, diaries, photographs, apparently left behind voluntarily by those who had passed through the inn. Dr. Eleanor Richards, who led the archaeological team, described the significance of the find. What we're looking at appears to be a repository of abandoned identities, tangible records of lives that were deliberately left behind. These weren't souvenirs taken from victims. They were intentionally preserved archives of former selves. Each box contains the documentation of a life: birth certificates, letters from family members, photographs, diaries, marriage licenses. It's as if each person who passed through this process felt compelled to preserve some record of who they had been, even as they chose to become someone else. One particularly revealing box contained the diary of a woman named Elizabeth Chambers, which described in agonizing detail her unhappy life with an abusive husband and her decision to disappear. The final entry, dated September 1894, simply read, "Tomorrow I become someone new. Elizabeth Chambers will cease to exist, and in her place will be born a free woman." The archaeological findings were documented in an academic paper published in the Journal of Historical Mysteries in 1985. The researchers concluded that the Ravenwood Inn likely served as a station in a clandestine network that helped people voluntarily disappear, not a criminal operation as initially suspected, but a secret service for those desperate to escape their lives. What we are witnessing through these artifacts, the paper concluded, is evidence of a phenomenon that likely occurred throughout history but has rarely been documented: the deliberate abandonment of identity. While modern bureaucracy makes such transitions increasingly difficult, in the late 19th century it would have been relatively simple to disappear from one place and reappear in another with a new name and history. The Ravenwood operation appears to have formalized and systematized this process, creating a comprehensive service for those willing to pay for a new beginning. In 1994, exactly 1 century after the Ravenwood disappearances, Dr. Elaine Montgomery, a historian with special interest in unsolved cases, undertook a comprehensive review of all available evidence related to the case. Her analysis, published in the Journal of American Mysteries, offered a new perspective on what might have occurred at the inn. Montgomery proposed that the Ravenwood operation might have been even more sophisticated than previously imagined, not just helping people disappear, but facilitating complete identity exchanges. Based on recovered correspondence and the patterns of arrivals and departures recorded in Mercer's guest book, she suggested that the inn might have functioned as a swap point, where 2 or more people could effectively exchange lives. Under this scheme, a bankrupt Chicago banker could exchange identities with a prosperous Texas rancher tired of his rural life. Each would assume the most desirable aspects of the other's life, with Mercer facilitating the exchange of documents, personal histories, and knowledge necessary to maintain the deception. This theory would explain the elaborate system of isolated rooms in the cellar, not for imprisonment, but to allow participants to spend days or weeks learning about their new identities without being seen by other guests. Consider the elegant simplicity of such an arrangement, Montgomery wrote. 2 individuals, each dissatisfied with their current circumstances but possessing attributes the other desires, could essentially trade places. The banker gains a prosperous ranch and escape from creditors. The rancher gains entry into urban society and a new profession. With proper coaching and documentation, each could step into the other's life with minimal suspicion, particularly if physical resemblance was reasonably close, which Mercer's records suggest was a consideration in matching participants. Montgomery's research uncovered several potential cases of such exchanges, including one particularly well-documented instance involving a Boston academic and a Colorado mine owner in 1893. Both men disappeared from their respective communities within days of each other, and within months. Each appeared to have assumed aspects of the other's life, the academic suddenly displaying practical knowledge of mining operations, the mine owner exhibiting unexpected erudition and familiarity with literary circles. What makes this case particularly intriguing, Montgomery noted, is that both men maintained certain aspects of their original expertise while adopting the social position of the other. This suggests not a complete erasure of self, but rather a transfer of social identity while maintaining core knowledge and skills. Exactly what one would expect in a well-managed identity exchange. Right. Montgomery's theory is perhaps the most plausible explanation for the Ravenwood mystery. It would account for all the strange aspects of the case: the disappearances, the laboratory-like facility in the cellar, the enigmatic symbols, and the eventual disappearance of the Mercers themselves. It wasn't a case of mass murder, but a highly secret consensual operation that went wrong when authorities began to investigate. In the final analysis, Montgomery concluded, the Ravenwood Inn may represent one of the most fascinating social experiments of the late 19th century, a deliberate attempt to challenge the fixity of identity in an era when such concepts were considered immutable. Bartholomew Mercer, whatever his motivations, created a system that allowed people to quite literally become someone else, to shed an unwanted life and adopt a preferred one. Whether this constitutes a crime, a service, or something else entirely remains a question for ethicists rather than historians. The case of the Ravenwood Inn remains officially unsolved. The 23 known missing travelers remain officially missing, though evidence strongly suggests that many may have reappeared elsewhere under new identities. Bartholomew and Victoria Mercer were never seen under their original names again, but may well have lived long lives as entirely different people. In 2018, an elderly woman named Margaret Lawson contacted the Arkansas Historical Society with an intriguing claim. Lawson, then 94, stated that her grandfather had been a client of what he called the Ravenwood service in the early 1890s. According to family lore passed down through generations, her grandfather had been a failed businessman from Chicago who had arranged to exchange identities with a prosperous store owner in a small Arkansas town. My grandfather spoke of it only once, near the end of his life, Lawson told researchers. He said that he had been on the verge of suicide when he learned of a place in the Ozarks where people could trade lives. He described a process that took several weeks, during which he lived in a room underground, learning everything about the man whose life he would assume, his family connections, business operations, personal habits. Meanwhile, this other man was learning about my grandfather's life, such as it was. When the exchange was complete, my grandfather took over a thriving general store, while the other man disappeared with whatever resources my grandfather had left. The family he acquired, a wife and 2 grown children, apparently knew nothing of the arrangement. He lived the remainder of his life as this other person, and, by all accounts, lived it well and honorably. The Historical Society researchers were unable to verify Lawson's claim independently, but noted that it aligned with Montgomery's theory of identity exchange and contained details about the Ravenwood operation that were consistent with evidence discovered at the site. As dusk falls over the Ozarks and shadows lengthen across valleys where old inns once stood, the mystery of Ravenwood remains not a tale of horror, but a fascinating exploration of the malleability of human identity. What happened at that isolated inn leads us to contemplate fundamental questions. What truly constitutes who we are? How easily might we leave our lives behind and start anew, and how many of us, if offered the chance, would choose to disappear completely? As you travel the winding roads of the Ozarks, passing through small towns and remote valleys where old inns still offer shelter to weary travelers, you might wonder about those around you. That local shopkeeper with the slightly odd accent and knowledge that seems out of place. That recluse who appeared in town decades ago with a vague story about his past. Could they be remnants of the Ravenwood network? People who chose to erase their former identities and begin again? The next time you stay at a remote inn, you might notice a peculiar look of recognition from the proprietor, or spot a discreet symbol carved into the wood above the fireplace. It could be merely your imagination. Or it could be a sign that the Ravenwood network never really disappeared, only became more discreet with the passing years. The inn where every guest vanished before dawn may be gone, but the mystery it represents, the possibility of starting over, of becoming someone entirely new, continues to fascinate. Because deep down, many of us have wondered at least once what it might be like to simply vanish.